Welcome to Voices of Esalen. I'm Sam Stern. Today's episode comes from a live conversation recorded here at Esalen during the spring of 2026, celebrating the release of the book In Trees, the latest, by New York Times bestselling author Robert Moor. Robert Moor is a journalist, an essayist, and the author of On Trails, a wide-ranging meditation on the paths made by animals, humans, and ideas. His work has appeared in The New Yorker, Harper's, The Atlantic, New York Times, Granta, many other publications. For this conversation, Robert is joined by Andrew Castle. He's Esalen's resident dendrophile and the chief weaver of the Treenet. It's a living project that celebrates the trees of the land of Esalen and all the special relationships that gather around them. As you'll hear, this conversation moves through forests, through language, attention, ecology, into the realm of intelligence and interconnection, and all the ways that living systems create meaning through relationship. So with no further ado, here's Robert Moor and Andrew Castle, recorded live at Esalen with an introduction by my colleague, Esalen's Director of Product, Sadia Bruce.
I'm very excited to have Robert Moor here. Robert, is that your publicist? Yeah. And so Julia reached out to me. Julia is his publicist at Simon & Schuster, and said, hey, this guy is going on a book tour on the West Coast. Would you all be interested in having him come to Esalen? I said, yes, of course. So I worked it out with her, and I had this bright idea to try to record it. It is being recorded, by the way, for Voices of Esalen, a podcast episode. But I asked Sam Stern, I said, Sam, would you be available? You have to please, interview Robert Moor. Let's let that be the stop that he makes here at Esalen on his tour. And as it turns out, Sam is actually out of office this week. He's not available. So he said, I won't be there, but you're welcome to do the interview. And I immediately thought, oh no, I'm a terrible interviewer. Truly not good at interviewing at all. And so this idea dropped into my mind, fully formed. I said, Andrew Castle, weaver of the Treenet, who's been to the Treenet this week. Okay, almost half the room. He should interview Robert. He should be in conversation, not interview, should be in conversation with Robert. So I reached out to Andrew. He was available. I was so excited, and I'm still so excited. So looking forward to this. The Treenet is a lot more than just a bunch of knots. So if you haven't had a chance to be there, go there, spend time there, do that. Last week, I had the chance with a bunch of the work scholars to lay on the Treenet. I told them to meet me on the Treenet, be horizontal on the Treenet at 3 p.m. tomorrow. And so we did that, and we had a beautiful time. I think we're ready to get into the discussion. It's Andrew Castle, the chief weaver of the Treenet, in conversation with Robert Moor, author of this gorgeous new book called In Trees. Thank you both for being here. Thank you so much.
Good evening, everybody.
Yeah, I have to say I'm on my book tour and I've done a bunch of these events, but this is the first one I've done with my shoes off. So kind of like it. I should start doing this all the time.
In California, it's an important tradition if you're talking about anything important.
Shoes off. Then we'll talk.
For those of you who haven't read this yet, it only just was published last week, but In Trees is fantastic. I was pretty completely wrapped for the whole last week, just drawing it in, anticipating this conversation, and being somebody who's very enmeshed in trees myself. And those of you who've been to the Treenet are aware that Treenets are explicitly about having a deeper relationship kinetically and relationally to a tree. The amount of research and detail and external reading that is on display here, and then just Robert having a very particular to him view of how he wants to relate to trees is really quite profound and covers a lot of topics that go outside of trees in ways that's you have to read it to know, and it's quite lovely. We've been thinking, as we've been talking about gathering here tonight, to do maybe a short reading and just wrap a little bit on some of the topics in the book. I read through it and I've been moved by some of the notions and concepts that are in there.
Yeah. April 7th, it came out. And I'll say it took me 9 years to write. So it's really incredible to have it out finally. Thank you. My husband Remy is here somewhere, although maybe he hasn't made it over yet, but I'd like to apologize to him for suffering beside me for 9 years while I wrote this book for so long, but it feels amazing to have it out finally.
And is there a dimension of that study that accounts for the duration of time, or did it just kept going deeper, deeper, and deeper? How does it?
So my first book is called On Trails, and that took me 7 years to write. I had 18 months according to my publishing agreement,
Sure.
and I missed the deadline by a considerable amount. And then the second time I thought, oh, it'd be so much easier. This time I've already done it once, and it was even harder. And partially it's because the pandemic, disrupted a lot of the travel that I wanted to do, but also, and I took a detour. I did a true crime podcast about a man named Joe Exotic, whom some of you may have heard of. And that was sort of a way for me to make money so that I could continue writing this book. But that also took me on a detour that lasted quite a while. So there were some twists and turns along the way, but honestly, a lot of it was just doing an obsessive amount of research and at a certain point realizing that the relationships I was building with people were making the writing better over time, because I was spending years with people and spending years revisiting places and revisiting various ideas. And so, it's hard for you guys to understand what the book is because it's such a strange thing. I'm trying to basically look at trees, as I say, as a way of being rather than just a type of being. So in addition to, physical trees, I went and climbed giant sequoias while working on a film crew with David Attenborough, and I slept in a chimpanzee nest while studying the evolutionary tree. But
It's an excellent chapter.
I also am looking at neurology and family trees and this sort of cosmic structure, I think, this way that life grows by branching out and then pruning back what doesn't work, gnarling around what does, and most importantly, sending down deep roots and remaining rooted to place and to other living beings. And so that's the theme that runs throughout every chapter, but I take it in a lot of strange directions.
One of the quotes that I've held on to as a reference for the overall big picture, but you wrote this: the long, slow, wild state of co-flourishing.
Yeah.
And the timeless amount of interweaving and interbeing, to use the Thich Nhat Hanh phrase, but the amount of going out and coming back and going out and coming back that is indicated here in edits and revisions. And it feels like a plant is growing as you read it.
Yeah.
And that was particularly interesting for me. With Treenets are all about layering and adding tension and adding force and nuance and detail over and over and over again until you suddenly have a fabric.
Yeah.
And words are a sort of fabric.
Yeah, they are. They're kind of a kind of net, I guess. Yeah, Ursula K. Le Guin calls it a carrier net. It's something that carries stories. But I think that this co-flourishing, that's not my term. I took that from a philosopher named Donna J. Haraway. Some of you may know, but the idea was, in the first chapter, I'm looking at how can you stay branchy in your life? How can you remain throughout your long life? The world is kind of designed, the modern world, to winnow us and to simplify us. And it makes you specialize in your job. And it makes, if you spend any time online, you can feel your thoughts becoming more reductive and more pointed. And you lose that sort of broader curiosity and experimental spirit you have when you're a kid. And this happens all the way down to a neuronal level, right? And your brain is maximally connected when you're a baby. And then you spend the rest of your life pruning. It's mostly what we do as we age, is prune away neural connections, because your brain has a really hard time creating new ones. And so I'm asking, how can you stay branchy? And one of the questions, this actually came from my editor, is he said, well, okay, if you're doing all this branching, what is it rooted to? What is the trunk of a life well lived? And it really was like a hard question, because he's basically asking, what's the meaning of life, right? I mean, is the meaning of life to get to heaven? Is it to achieve enlightenment? Is it, to maximize your personal pleasure or your personal wealth, or, God forbid? And the idea that I eventually came to is that it is to flourish with others over time, to put it as simply as possible, that this philosophers often use this phrase flourishing. And Donna J. Haraway added this co-flourishing to mean it's not just you flourishing in your own personal development. You have to flourish with others. Otherwise, what's the point? And then the over time is, there's a lot of, some of you have probably seen them or lived in them. There's a lot of beautiful communities that spring up, intentional communities, Burning Man, what have you. But it's like the blooming of a flower, and then it all falls away. It can't last for very long. A tree, the incredible thing is they flourish over centuries or millennia, So how do they do that? It's just a question I was obsessed with.
There's something about trees too growing in all directions at once. And that connection to rootedness, as you reference in later chapters, there's quite a bit of emphasis in this gentleman's writing on what it means to be where you are and to feel a sense of pushing into the place. And there's a whole chapter on lineage and ancestry and relationship to the stories of our families and how much that spreads out, particularly in America. I found that section really moving, being so, how much dissonance there is in so many of our life stories, especially out here on the West Coast. And the American story is very much about displacement and sort of absence of presence. And to have that emphasis be plant-like in the writing it shifted the way I was thinking, I'm feeling about my own family line or the history of this place or this landscape that we're in. Do you feel like as you've published the book and gone down the road, do you feel like your relationships with your family and your community has changed from that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's two ways. The first is, so I traced my family tree. It sounds like you've tried this as well. Maybe some of you have too. It's an interesting experience, especially if your family's been in the United States for a long time. As mine has, you have to grapple with some pretty dark stuff, right? And it happened almost immediately. We hired, my dad and I got a genealogist. Mine is Robert Moor. There's a lot of Moors out there, so it was not easy. We went on Ancestry and just got confused immediately. But the genealogist came back to us and he traced our family line back to a guy named Hezekiah Moore who lived in Alabama in the 1700s, in the 1800s, and he points out on the census records, in 1860, Hezekiah owns these two enslaved women. And in 1870, one of those women is living next door to him and she has, quote unquote, mulatto children. And he said, you can put two and two together. The sexual exploitation of enslaved women was just rampant back then. And so I looked on Ancestry and I typed in this woman's name, Lucinda Moore, and I found that someone had put her and Hezekiah together like they were a married couple. And they listed all these descendants. And the account was private. It was anonymous. And so I just on a whim messaged his account. And, when you reach out to someone like that online, it's like 1 in a million they write back. And within 15 minutes, I had a message back in my inbox from this Black woman named Gia Gray. And she's like, oh, hey, cousin, how's it going? And I was like, oh, my God, actually. So and she said, I had to make my account anonymous because white families kept blocking me when they saw that I was Black. And
Ouch.
she was descended, her line has been in the United States for a long time as well, including she's descended from the quartermaster for Nathan Bedford Forrest, who was the first Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan. And so you can imagine that those people would not exactly love to find out that they have black cousins. And so we went back to Alabama together and we traced our family tree. And that's how I started thinking about, this idea of, first of all, the branchiness of the human family tree. Obviously, we're all related, right? And we're all kin to one another on a deep enough timeline. And that's something we tend to forget all too often. But also the idea of rootedness. My family's so uprooted and hers as well for very different reasons. Her family had gone from Alabama through Oklahoma and mine had gone through Texas, but they ended up settling both in Illinois, like a 30-minute drive from each other. So we both grown up right next to each other, never knew it at the same time. And that's true of all of us, right? We all have family all around us. You don't know that, but they're there. And so the rootedness aspect, I've settled in Canada now. I live in British Columbia. And, it's a hot topic right now, as it should be, of the question of indigeneity and what right do we have to live on stolen land? And how do you come to a state of reconciliation with people who have been in this land for tens of thousands of years, and I showed up 10 years ago, that's the toughest question of the whole book. And I think one of the biggest questions in environmental philosophy is the question of rootedness and how do you become a responsibly rooted person on land that, ancestrally is not yours and that was taken from someone else.
Powerful thoughts. The notion I've heard spoken from Martine Frechtel of culture is mostly about language and mostly about relationship to place and how complex that is becoming with the amount of different histories and stories that are now commingling everywhere. Like it's not just the West as a bound up, knotted place. It's the world now and how we speak to each other and how we frame those stories being really relevant to the possibility of having a sense of place or root there.
Yeah.
And it kind of goes back to the branching part, but you use a Russian word in the book, and the idea of the quality of energy that's behind that branching and the quality of energy that's behind that growth.
Yeah.
Could you speak to that?
Yeah, there's a term the Russians have, which is dikost, Dikost, and it means like wildness or eccentricity. One of the people I became obsessed with writing this book was Leo Tolstoy, the famous author, and he had this quality where even in his 70s he was, swimming in the icy sea, and he taught himself to ride a bike at the age of 70. He was like, playing quote unquote ferocious games of tennis. He was just wildly alive. They said every day he wanted to do everything, including gymnastics. And he just read everything. He just was so branchy. And this quality of Dikost extended. He actually got into a fight with a bear one time and ended up with a scar on his face for the rest of his life. He just was wildly alive. And I love that quality. And that's something that I think he managed. If you read his writing, his vast novels, War and Peace and Anna Karenina, are each just, almost 1,000 pages. Yeah, staggering, just bricks. But they have this sense of a trunk to them, right? He's pulling everything together. And that's something as a writer and as a thinker, it's so hard to do, but it's so important, because otherwise you just become like a cloud. I'm really interested in this idea of shapes of thought, as a phrase that Immanuel Kant used. That we need a revolution in our shape of mind. And I think that there is a way in which a tree is a beautiful kind of compromise between having a mind like a tower, which is very hierarchical and narrow, and then having a mind like a cloud, which is just nebulous and loose and there's no center to it. I find that to be a really beautiful shape of thought.
Fascinating. Yeah. Are there other plants that have come to mind as you've been delving into these types of relationships? That with the tree nets, for sure, there's many, many layers of fiber that go in and in. And so you start with just a single strand that's thicker and heavier, sort of a foundation. And then you pull against that and you pull against that. And you're iteratively adding more and more length of time and length of surface. And you create a fabric eventually out of just individual stories or individual maneuvers or individual techniques, and you're storing kinetic energy with each one of those. And I think about that with tree branches often, and the analogy to the book feels pretty direct, of each story reaching out this way and having all the little leaves and photosynthesis that it can do that way, and you can't overdo it because you also got to be back over here and keeping the trunk stable throughout.
In terms of other plants, I mean, there's a lot of other, up in the canopy, as there's often a lot of other plants up there, which I'm astounded, especially in redwoods, an astounding amount of life, not just mosses, but, epiphytes. And I once saw a bonsai growing, a little tan oak in the top of a giant redwood, coast redwood, which was so cool. And berry bushes. And if you guys read The Wild Trees, about that book, Richard Preston, that's a great book. And he just describes that aerial garden that you find up there.
Yeah,
so
it talks about harvesting huckleberries 150 feet in the air.
Yeah, just sitting up in a tree 150 up there eating. Yeah, it's so cool. On the philosophical level, there's this notion of the rhizome, right, which was Deleuze and Guattari had this idea of like the ideal structure is decentralized, it's perfectly horizontal.
1,000 plateaus.
1,000 plateaus, exactly. And they actually hated trees. They thought that trees were like fascist structures because they have this one trunk. And so all the branches are coming together into this one trunk, like all these generals, reporting to a Der Fuhrer. And I fight against that like really strenuously. I think it's ridiculous, especially because there's this other philosopher named Michael Marder who points out all the ways that trees are, amazingly strange and anti-fascist. I mean, they can change genders throughout their lives, and they're multiple. They're not. You can take a branch off of one and plant it somewhere else, and there's all these ways that they can break out of whatever box a sort of fascistic structure would want to put them in, and they complicate hierarchy in all sorts of fascinating ways. But they do have that trunk, which I like. So yeah, I'm still a tree defender.
Tree defending.
In more ways than one, I guess.
The link there to a sense of wonder, which you write about, the shortest way I describe what a treenet is a throne for the feeling of wonder. And even today, we're interacting with some folks on the land here, and the aha, sort of bright, like because I'm alive, I'm happy. There's some sense of mystery and joy that spontaneously is in your body when you put yourself onto this piece of art, and that doing that with words is also an art as well. And as I was reading the book, there's a couple of passages specifically about the sense of wonder, and you take that idea to a couple further steps. And there's a link there, I feel like, to animism and the notion of the plant, particularly a tree, having a personality or a sovereignty to itself. Could you say something about how that has grown for you in the process of writing?
Yeah. So there's two parts. That the first is the wonder. I mean, I think most of us have felt that in the presence of a tree. And the time I got to climb to the top of a giant sequoia, that was just the most powerful sense of it I've had, just because of the scale. The scale of those sequoias is so incredible, and being able to do it in Sequoia National Park was a real honor. And I think that the key for me about wonder is that first of all, it often makes you feel small, but like in a good way, in a healthy way. It puts you in perspective. But it also, when it's really intense, will dissolve the boundaries of the self, and you'll start to bleed over, and you can feel. I mean, whether you're doing this through psychedelics or just a walk in the woods, you feel yourself tethered to the larger force, and when you're in the branches of a tree, as you've been so many times, it's a special variety of wonder, because you can feel your life in the tree's hands. There's almost a childlike quality to it, where it's like, this thing is holding me. This thing that is so many times my size is holding me like a little baby bird in its hand, and it could drop me. It could drop me at any moment. And so that's it for me. That is like wonder plus gratitude, and that is the
Yes.
most beautiful combination. There's this writer named Warren Tormey who describes how that was really at the heart of the environmental movement, with the conservation movement around the time of John Muir and the early conservationists, is that trees like the giant sequoias were so awe-inducing that the thought of cutting them down was sacrilege. It really, to many people, struck them as sacrilege. And it was the first time it broke the logic of the market, because before that, trees were so valuable and farms were so valuable. It was like, well, yeah, it's beautiful, but cut it down, get it out of the way. And when they started to fell the giant sequoias, there was this uproar, just an enormous uproar. And there's a senator named John Conness here in California who, argued that they should set aside the Mariposa Big Tree Grove, which, ends up becoming really kind of like the heart of Yosemite. And they said, there's no precedent for this. What do you mean protect these trees for no reason? Why, just to stand there? And he said, there can be no precedent because there's no place on earth like it. He just thought the sequoias were so special. And so that's when you sort of wonder turns into what Warren Tormey calls wonder as an ethical force, which I find such a beautiful phrase.
Yeah, that's one of the quotes that's tagged here. I was in Yosemite a week ago and had a view of Mount Conness from the center of the park, which is Mount Hoffman. And right at that place is where the biome shifts to start having juniper trees and lodgepole pines mixed together, which is, at those elevations, there's not a huge diversity of large plants, particularly trees. And so every single one of them has a huge amount of character and personality. And when you're walking through that landscape, it becomes pretty obvious that you don't have words for how important this is. And that's where the animist thought, especially in your writing, feels really intriguing to me, because there's, without trying to co-opt or be in any way putting yourself onto another culture's views, there is some strong intuitive awareness, or maybe just root human capacity for relationship that can interact with the more than human world in a way that is, universal, say.
Yeah. This is one I really grappled with, and I think in the last like 10 or 15 years, you've seen a lot of writing about the interiority of trees, or the personhood of trees. If you read the Hidden Life of Trees by Peter Volobin, or The Overstory by Richard Powers,
For the Mother Tree
Search
too,
for the Mother
which
Tree
came
by
out,
Susan Simard, absolutely. There's this notion that trees have personhood, and they are, they have intentionality and agency, and they're sharing resources through the mycorrhizal network. And to a certain degree, I can follow that line of reasoning up to a certain point, but where I stop is I think that if you go too far with that, you can actually start to collapse the otherness of trees, the profound otherness of trees, which is part of their beauty and their what makes them so special, and actually what makes them so challenging, right, to us, I think, is that like we find it really easy to extend our compassion to things that are like us. Your family, it's almost automatic, and then your community is a little harder. Then maybe like, a dog is pretty easy, but like a snake is kind of hard. And then like a spider is very hard. And then a stone is impossible, right? And that moss is kind of like on the other side of that line. But trees, to me, stand right on that line. They're like right on the dividing line between what we can empathize with, what we can imagine our way into their inner life, and what we can't. And so in that way, they're an ethical challenge to us. And some people, I imagine a lot of people in this room, find it very easy to want to protect a tree. And a lot of other people think it's ridiculous. They think it's just absolutely, silly. And so the trying to appreciate the agency of a tree without collapsing that otherness is, I think, a really important challenge for us intellectually. And I've been trying to think it through. I mean, because the other thing is that like our sense of personhood is historically mediated, right? Like we get that from the European Enlightenment, the idea of individualism, that we are contained, we are individuals. And other cultures have the idea of being individuals, right? They are interconnected with other people. And in fact, your identity is socially formed. And without that society, you almost wouldn't exist as you exist. Like you would still be a human animal, but you wouldn't be you, and you, in the larger sense of that word. And so I think it's important also to keep some sense of perspective when you're thinking about what is a tree, because when a lot of indigenous cultures are envisioning the personhood of a tree, it's not like a human with branches and leaves. It's often an inspirited being.
Yeah.
And that spirit can like leave the tree very often, right? If you cut down the tree, the spirit will continue and it will fucking haunt you, right? It'll come get you. It will make you sick. And that is a really important ethical component is that it's much, much stranger, and there's Marshall Sahlins in The New Science of the Enchanted Universe writes about, multiple spirits being in one being, or, that things can be inside of other spirits. It's much, much more complicated than just like trees as persons. That notion of persons is a legal framework, and it's kind of been useful in a lot of ways, as Rob McFarlane writes about in his great book, Is a River Alive? But I think we're at the very beginning of that conversation, and it's going to get a lot weirder and a lot more interesting as more indigenous voices weigh in about how they make sense of, the personhood, the agency, the interiority of plants and other living things.
Thank you.
It's a little lecture I just
Yeah.
gave. Sorry about that.
That was the best rant so far. Going for round two here.
Can I ask you a question about the treetops?
Yes.
Do you find that your sense of time changes when you're up in a tree?
100%. That ties in nicely to the volley I'm going to bring back to you here, but the flow state absorption of being in a process that has a sequence that's totally natural doesn't lend itself to clocks or time. Or a friend of mine said something offhand the other day that's staying with me, but if you measure your life by productivity, you are a slave. And I've been thinking about that a lot, and this is the question to come back, but you read about double vision or two-eyed seeing, and there's a whole other theme in this book that's quite interesting, but this gentleman also has a good amount of meditation practice behind him and a relationship with Buddhism, which is a place where we have a lot of overlap. I was raised in a Buddhist household, and there's a teaching that's core to the Buddhist idea of, they call it dependent origination, where everything you can encounter, all phenomenon you make contact with your consciousness, is but a moment in another sequence that's perhaps much longer or much faster than you can touch with your capacity to perceive. And trees meddle with that a lot, because you can look at a tree and easily imagine the house that it could become, or easily imagine the bear that might have lived in there, or the teeny itsy seed that got rained on that started it. And where in time is that? It's all visible to you there, and that being the core idea of what dependent arising is. But then the question I had for you is going the reverse direction of sort of rarefying traditional cultures' views. But is there something in this sense of wonder, sort of culture of relationship, that is the more proactive decolonial process for the conditioned Western minds? Does that question make sense?
Say this.
Say it a slightly different way. The work that cultures that have been disconnected are doing to choose to not be disconnected, as opposed to grasping after something that's still intact or continuing to sort of mine cultures that have relationships like that. Like, what is the advent of new relationships that could carry forward in a healthy way?
Yeah, that's a really tough one. Because that question of first of all, that term two-eyed seeing comes from a man named Elder Albert Marshall, who's a Mi'kmaq elder. And that idea is that you can, indigenous cultures are alive and thriving in the present, right? They're not frozen in the past. And part of that means that they have many ways of seeing simultaneously, and they're going off to university and learning, biology just like everyone else. And they can hold that in mind at the same time as they can maintain their ancient traditions. And they can use both of those lenses at once, or maybe in an alternating fashion. The hard part, the question of like appropriation, is a really tough one, because it is often very thin. Like the way that we, as settlers, engage with indigenous cultures, even when it's sincere, is like can feel really thin and kind of just it's like a colorful scarf, you kind of, or like a shawl or something you put on and then you take it off. And that is not the heart of this. The heart of indigeneity, as I understand it, is, well, I'll quote someone else because I don't want to speak for them, but there's a Cherokee philosopher named Brian Burkhart who says it's being in kinship and being in the land. Those are the two keys. And so being in kinship is being in kinship with everything, but being in the land means that everything is localized, right? It's not this thing you can just sort of lift up and take wherever you want. It's not Coca-Cola that you can ship to any country in the world and it tastes just as good. It's localized. It comes out of the land. The meaning actually springs out of the land through us, and it comes through language, and it comes through lore and mythology. And this is something that, if any of you have, spoken with indigenous elders, most of the ones I've spoken with have a similar trait, which is the way they tell stories is intensely localized, to the point where it's almost exhausting, right? Like they're like this guy, Elder Bill Jones, who was at Fairy Creek, this old growth logging blockade I was at. He would tell stories, and he'd start telling a story, and then he'd say, it's on that one bridge over this river in the forest. And do you know where that is? And I'd have to pretend like I knew it was, because he wouldn't tell the story unless I just was, oh yeah, I know where that is. Because he knew every inch of the forest. He knew every inch of his land. And if he wasn't telling me where it was taking place, the story didn't have the same meaning. The story would feel thin. And as someone who's profoundly uprooted, that, didn't really click for me. It was like kind of this frustrating thing until I started to realize that the localization is the key. And that's why it is such a profound trauma and crime to uproot indigenous societies from their land, right? I mean, to the Trail of Tears, I talk about this in my first book. You take the Cherokee out of North Carolina and that larger region, and you move them over to Oklahoma. Well, they still have their stories, but the stories aren't being told on the land where the stories came from. And one Cherokee scholar said you could stand on the mountaintop where this one story takes place. It's a race between these turtles, and you can see the backs of the turtles, right? I mean, it is happening right here, and that's the point. And there's all these ethical information, botanical information, all this information is right here. It's in the land. It's right in front of you. And that ties back through time as well, right? That element you're talking about of time, just countless generations of this beautiful knowledge continuing to evolve and to deepen. And that's just, like I talk about in the book, there's my friend of mine is a journalist named Brooke Jarvis. She has this quality, I don't know what you call it, affliction called anosmia. She can't smell. She has no sense of smell. And she did not know that she didn't have a sense of smell, because she didn't know what a sense of smell was until she was in her 20s, and she was hugging a dog that had been sprayed by a skunk. And her sister said, what are you doing? And she's like, I I thought everyone was like, she just thought that was how the world was.
Wow.
And that's how I feel like I had I do to some degree, to a large degree, still have a form of like spiritual anosmia. I'm lacking that sense of localized, deep relationship to place and to we might call them the spirits of the land, that when I see it in others, I recognize it right away. And, I think that that's something that we should try to foster, but it's going to take a long time, and that's what Elder Bill says. He's like, you got to recognize, he's like, you will grow into it when you're ready, but, some people have been doing this a lot longer than you have. So just have some respect, have some humility, like, don't always put yourself at the center of the story.
Yes, indeed. The notion of stewardship is really evoked by that awareness, and particularly in the amount of, the Gordian knot of our society currently, where there are two things are true at once to such a excruciating degree that doing anything almost feels, like there's a sense of being tied down, of being trapped or something. And I read a lot from Martine Prechtel, who discusses this idea quite in depth from a traditional person's perspective, and being part European descendancy as well. He has always been sort of a world bridger, and the notion that the way that you relate to the language that comes from the land and your way of being in place, like to be in a place well, is the process towards becoming a welcome presence there. And trees as a ally in that process. And I think about that a lot with the Treenets, in the sense of to create a space where that feeling of a language that's bigger than you have words for in your language, there's a sense of truly being held by something bigger than you as a potential avenue to feeling what it would feel like to not immediately get something, or a lot of the loops we go in as conditioned Western people to have some, how do we stop extracting from our attention and from the land and then be there?
Yeah, the extraction and optimization and all of that. Yeah, I mean, that's something, it's interesting to think about, like you up in the nets and just the feeling of being in the treetops, how that feeling, it is a sort of meditation, isn't it? I mean, I love forms of meditation where they force you to meditate, right? I mean, it's like, it's one thing, it's hard to sit on a mat.
Inherent
Yes.
somehow, yeah.
Yeah, there's a you're a Vipassana practitioner. There's a Vipassana guru named Sunlun Sayadaw in Burma. You may or may not have heard of, but he was said to have achieved enlightenment just by feeling the feeling of his hoe. He was gardening, and he just felt the feeling of the handle against his hand. And a monk happened to pass by and was sort of giving a Dharma talk, and he just caught like a fragment of it, and that's all it took. And in that moment, he achieved nirvana. I mean, and I think that climbing a tree really forces that awareness on you, that direct awareness, but also that feeling of gratitude, right? And the sense of time. I mean, all those things together are such a beautiful combination. And then you add the next element, which is if you're doing it, if you're willing to get arrested, you do that in a tree sit. Stop a forest from getting cut down, or stop an oil pipeline from getting built, or stop, as they do in Germany, stop a coal mine from expanding. People all over the world are still using tree sits. And so that, again, that's the ethical force, right? That's you and your own personal flourishing, but now pushing it into trying to disrupt the carbon economy or extraction of, timber, whatever it may be, try to make the world a better place. I think we've sort of trained unwittingly an army of potential protesters and tree sitters, because everyone's meditating now, and that's mostly what you do in a tree sit. I mean, I did two tree sits, and it's just a lot of sitting there. You're just sitting all day, and
sit is half of it.
Yeah, you just sit, and then sometimes you got to evade the police or get arrested or something, but.
There's context of the Fairy Creek blockade, which is in Vancouver Island, old antique cedar trees, correct?
Yeah. There's yellow cedars, there's Doug firs, there's red cedars, but yeah, ancient cedars, and it's an intact watershed. That's the really important thing, is that it's this watershed, and so every aspect, every side of it is intact, has never been logged, and they were coming in to log it, and a group of people just threw up a blockade like almost on a whim, and it was quite cool what they did, because they rolled in this massive crosswise slice of a huge old growth tree, and they rolled it in, and it was sort of like a reminder of like, this is what you guys are going to be cutting down, but also they were stopping the
actual
logging trucks from getting in, and then they set up a lot of tree sits, and it ended up becoming the largest mass uprising, civil uprising, the largest mass arrest in Canadian history. It's just, I think 1,200 people showed up and eventually got arrested and, pepper sprayed in the face and were being dragged along logging roads, just brutalized in all kinds of ways. It was really a remarkable thing to behold.
Yes, it appears that there was more to this conversation, but it was cut off early due to a recording malfunction. That's okay. You got a taste of the wonderful Andrew Moor. And if you want more, read the book, In Trees. It's out now at all places that sell books. Thank you for listening to Voices of Esalen. Today's show is produced in conjunction with Shira Levine. Our theme music is by Nico Holloman. Until next time, be well.